Welcome to Disasters Maybe, a podcast about disasters in contemporary fiction. I'm Jordi Serrano Muñoz, and in this show, I talk with scholars and writers about what it means to invoke catastrophes to interpret our present and our future. When we imagine stories about our future in ecological terms, it is very common to bring to mind scenarios of doom and gloom, of worse conditions, of having a really bad time. But that's not all there is. We can also find stories that want to do something a bit more difficult. They invite us to inhabit a better future. They want us to imagine scenarios where solutions have been met. And sustainability is not an aspiration or an ideologically contested term, but an undisputed matter of fact. Today, I talk with Ciarán Kavanagh about the emotional appeal of these hopeful stories, which are often bundled together under the label of Solarpunk. And basically, we explore what it means to bring disaster imagination to this cheery mix. Ciarán's research is very interesting to the purposes of this project because he's currently working on awe emotions, that is, on affective responses to the large scale, the vastness, the sublime, the humbleness that is associated with challenges like the climate crisis. We discuss what is the relationship between disasters and awe, and how can fiction help us navigate these feelings. And to do so, we chat about one of the most famous solarpunk stories in the English-speaking canon, Becky Chambers' Monk and Robot series. So, if you want to learn more about how to feel good living through our disastrous world, stick around. Ciarán Kavanagh's work generally explores not just what science fiction means, but what it does to the people who read it. That is basically how it makes them feel. Ciarán has been particularly interested in how science fiction can create different affective responses in readers, from awe to boredom or any other feelings they perhaps did not expect when they picked that book. He is currently an associate researcher at Ghent University, but is at the time of recording conducting an international fellowship at the KWI Essen. Ciarán holds a PhD in English literature, specializing in reader response theory by University College Cork. His first monograph, Refiguring Reader Response, is due out with University of Nebraska Press in 2027. Ciarán, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I sound like very expansive in that introduction, almost as if I wrote it myself.
Who knows? My first question has to do with this attention that you pay to readers' emotions, which I think it's very interesting, especially when you compare it with your current project, right? So you study not just what science fiction suggests or offers in terms of stories, of imagined scenarios, but also on how readers feel when they engage with it, right? These textures of fascination, and that also may include boredom or disengagement or of just being asked to sustain attention through difficulty, basically. And now you're developing this new line of research around this concept of awe. Before we get into the specific territory we're here to discuss today, because awe and disasters may be related, I'd like to understand that shift. What is actually awe? Which is perhaps a question that you get asked about quite often. And why do you think it deserves as much attention if we are to understand what's going on these days in this crazy world of ours?
Yeah, it's in some ways it's like the opposite emotion of boredom. And I've done some work on climate literature and boredom before, but it is, and I guess this is where I came across, it's kind of very deeply entangled in boredom at the same time. That connection, I think we'll probably get into point by point as we talk, especially with some of the texts that I want to talk about later, which I think are very awe-inspiring to some and very boring for others. And it's not a case of either or, it's actually that these emotions are connected. But yeah, I guess I'll start with awe first. So on the let's say the scientific side, the big side, what I have been talking about in my research recently is awe emotions. So we're used to the word of awe, a kind of sense of wonder or a sense of being overwhelmed by something. In English at least, you might be in awe of someone or of an event. It's often associated with reverence, like spiritual or religious feelings, but also with authority or with natural wonder and the sublime. And even in that little explanation, you'll notice that I'm moving through quite a few different synonyms. So wonder, reverence, the sublime, everything else. Well, there is a field called All Studies, which is about just over 20 years old at this point. And this field has started talking about all emotions. So basically, all of these connected terms that I've just said, they have, I guess, this psychological field has provided the frameworks to understand these actually as the same emotion. That we have an emotion that these psychologists or emotion studies experts call all, and that it includes lots of different valences. Basically, in emotion studies, a valence is it defines the intensity of the emotion, so whether it is high intensity or low intensity, and whether it is felt as negative or positive. So you could have something like a sense of wonder, which is a very high intensity, high positivity, something then like dread or horror, which is actually defined by the same bodily effects, but kind of negative versions of it. So the scientific version of all would say that it is defined or that it is a response to a vastness, something vast, maybe something complex or nuanced. And that vastness could be in terms of scale. So it could be something on the planetary scale or the cosmic scale or the divine scale, but could also be something microscopic. If you've ever felt that kind of sense of wonder, at the kind of zoomed in life of, bacteria or even smaller that is on the skin surface, and you realize that you yourself are kind of a world that is hosting other species. So it's a scalar emotion, which I think is why it is very interesting to people who are interested in things like the Anthropocene and climate change. It goes all the way from the universal down to the, single-celled organism, down to the atomic level as well. And so we have different gradations, I suppose, of awe. I've named a few of them, like wonder. We could also bring in the emotion of the sublime into awe. And what is interesting about all studies is it really was an example of the sciences taking a concept from the humanities. So, and finding that concept to be correct. So the earliest work on all studies looked at things like Burke's definition of the sublime and different variations of this, like Weber as well, and basically tested, is this a real emotion? I think it's Dacher Kelchner, I think he recounts in kind of being in the lab in those early days and people telling him this was a dead end. This is not a real emotion. This is kind of a confluence of emotions, or it's a humanistic thing. And successive research did find, no, this is a real distinctive emotion. It is different from, an apprehension of beauty, that basically Edmund Burke got everything right, that it has an element of fear to it. It is scalar. One has to situate oneself in terms of the vastness. That's the kind of mental effort, I guess. And again, on the climate level, it's so easy to talk about in all terms because you have yourself, the individual, caught between a kind of infinite future, or what maybe should have been an infinite future, and now it seems a bit closed off. But you're also inheriting the sins of hundreds of years ago. You're being affected by the plastic cup that wasn't recycled at the other side of the world, and you're the same kind of, you're both the domino and you're the finger that's flicking the domino. So you're caught up in this kind of vast network of crises, vast network of individual actions. Your carbon footprint is being counted and quantified. It's kind of almost like a cosmic or kind of a climatological karma system where you get to tell everyone the exact extent to which you caused the Anthropocene and the end of the world. So you can see how positioning the person in these big networks that really do move from the atomic level in terms of like a carbon molecule, I suppose. Carbon a molecule? No, it's an element. You have to have a bit of science to do science fiction. Not much, but like just a touch. All the way up to the huge climatological systems. And so that's awe-inspiring, but tends to be of that negative bent of awe. So that's maybe that's the why now aspect of it. Why is our sense of awe changing? I think because awe is so wrapped up in the future and how the future that you cause. And now most of the stories about the futures that we cause tend to be bad ones, rather than like, we're going to be part of the next liberation or the next revolution or whatever.
Since I started like getting to know more about your work, the concept, this I don't know if it's dual, but this plural understanding of awe. I find it very productive when it comes to trying to frame also reactions to disasters, especially because we see that disasters can be understood basically as these event-focused episodes: earthquake, the hurricane, the strike and shock of something that happens at a specific moment that creates this sense of fear and dread, but at the same time a kind of particular beauty and fascination precisely because of its scale and its damage, and the opposite of a disaster, of a long catastrophic collapse that spans and that basically can't really have the same effective response because you cannot sustain this awesomeness for a very long period of time. You really need, it's a very intense emotion, I guess. So, but at the same time, it is embedded in these two things. I said the awesomeness because as a non-native English speaker, maybe the first time that I encountered awe is particularly in the awesome part of the world as something that is way more common and that has also like this very positive element to it. I was interested in trying to couple these emotions together, putting in dialogue disasters and a positive awesomeness and a hopefulness, basically. And you were saying this about imagining better futures or trying to imagine something that is projected into the future, something positive. And well, we discussed about what story should we talk about today, and you suggested Becky Chambers' A Psalm for the Wild Build, which I guess it's one of the most popular or one of the most referenced stories in the English-speaking canon of Solarpunk, which I would define as this genre of science fiction that tries to imagine just what a good future might actually look like. And it plays with ideas on utopia, not necessarily a utopian, but at least a world where humans have figured out how to live alongside nature rather than against it. And I was very interested in this book when you pitched it to me because I think it goes against common tropes of the post-apocalyptic genre. It doesn't pretend that a disaster never happened. In the story, a disaster happened in the past. It was basically this environmental collapse that human created, but then they chose to withdraw. And it is interesting because the story and the society that came after in this story is not actually dystopian. It is really kind of nice. And in Chambers' story, the catastrophe, I guess, remains in the background, but especially in the temporal back. It is embedded in the history, but is absent from the texture of the novel itself, which basically focuses on, well, people getting along, on adaptation, on everything working quite nicely. Basically, I was more interested when you pitch this story in what can, in your view, Solarpunk stories do with catastrophe, maybe with the affective texture of catastrophe. Do you think that they move through disasters, beyond disasters, or what is the role of disaster imagination in this kind of fiction, let's say?
It's an interesting route into solarpunk to think about disaster because it's almost definitionally anti-disaster, or not anti-disaster, but I think heart of solarpunk is a resistance of the spectacle of disaster, and it partially comes through that punk aspect. Science fiction people will put punk on the end of anything. It's kind of like, Watergate, and then we have every type of gate came afterwards. But I think in solarpunk it does make sense. The idea, say in cyberpunk, which was the initial kind of punk, was that it was street level characters, kind of streetwise, disaffected. They're kind of using the science fiction world or the new technologies of it in a way that was not intended. It's the kind of black market science fiction. And it was somewhat connected to kind of punk ideas and kind of the hacker movement and so on. I think solarpunk is maybe rerouted from the kind of disaffected street level character to the community. So it's not necessarily the singular inventor, that kind of protagonist who's trying to create a better world. It's the person who's on the ground struggling with what they have. Maybe what they have is less than what they should have, but they're trying to make it work. And so often the solarpunk text is more about a single community's kind of overcoming or trying to overcome. At the same time, it's kind of hard to define solarpunk at this time because it is a genre that's in the process of becoming, let's say. There's very few published works, say by traditional publishers, that can be called solarpunk. There's a few works that have been kind of claimed as solarpunk, or that you could read it as solarpunk, but the Psalm for the Wild Built would be the first work in English, at least, that we would consider definitively solarpunk, because it was actually commissioned as solarpunk. Becky Chambers was commissioned to write a solarpunk text. The genre itself started among kind of activist circles, and it came from a desire to write stories basically with like a positive sense of wonder towards the future. Basically, people noticed there was a profusion of technological dystopias, and there was this idea that maybe we should be, maybe the kind of constant doom and gloom, the kind of I don't know, the ironic distance that you have to have from the future. Maybe science fiction is more than just its warning function. Maybe we have to kind of turn the wheel to the utopian side as well to think of what kind of future is worth living in. And so, and I'll link this up to catastrophe in a moment, but I think my interest in Solarpunk isn't that experiential side. So it is, again, my work is broadly kind of reader oriented, and that's when I'm going into a text critically, I suppose I'm thinking about the reader. And so I'm thinking, what is the worth of spending time in these futures? One thing I kind of like to emphasize at points is how much time you spend in a book. The Sound for the Wild, but it is not a particularly long book. But if, you think of spending hours and hours and hours with one idea, with living in a different world, forming that world kind of cognitively, and then it may outlive that kind of moment of the reading as well as you talk about it, as it kind of becomes part of your mental architecture, that I think it is important to think about the emotional texture of what that time in the future, in a possible, potential, imaginary, speculated future feels like. And for the catastrophe element, then, I think if we are already in catastrophe, if we are kind of in permanent pre, during, and post-catastrophe, with the Anthropocene as a kind of permanent sequence and series and interconnection of catastrophes, then, if you're trying to help out at the end of a catastrophe, if you're thinking about a singular thing like a hurricane, you're thinking about the life you rebuild afterwards, you're thinking about what you can save, what harm you can mitigate, and what is worth building again. And I think having a vision of what is worth building again is very important, because if we are rebuilding what we already have, that's kind of off the table, right? Because what we already have is what's causing the catastrophe. So we have in catastrophe, we have to rebuild. If we rebuild what we have, it's just downhill again. So having and spending time in an alternately imagined future that might be worth living in, where you enjoy the time you spent, you're thinking, actually, I could see a role for myself or a role for the next generation. I can see happiness in a future that looks very, very different from the present. And so I think A Sound for the Wild Built is, and we're going to talk about, I think, the affects of that novel in a moment, but it is interesting for that. I think it's not necessarily post-apocalyptic. In the text, it's somewhat ambiguous, but if it was not exactly set on Earth, but it's basically a kind of Earth parallel, I think it's actually set on a moon. But the apocalypse never happened because, if you haven't read the book before, basically it's very highly advanced society. Everything is run by robots. They called it the factory age. And one day the robots kind of gained sentience all at the same time and just stood up and said, we're out. You need to sort this out. They kind of brokered a kind of agreement with the humans, but all the robots pushed themselves off the floor and just walked into the wilderness. And so it was not that humanity came together and saved themselves, it's that they had no other choice. So that's the speculative jumping off point, is actually the disaster was never prevented. It was kind of magically stopped from happening, and they had no choice but to build a different world, basically. As a reader, we don't have access to a disaster. We don't have any spectacle. We're quite a few 100 years or something after the robots have stood up, and no one has seen them since. And we're kind of living in a not low tech in terms of, caveman, but a kind of, how would you say, that their technology is more advanced than ours, but it doesn't use any fossil fuels or plastics or anything else. So it's very much 3D printed, organic, eco-plastics, very low carbon output technology, kind of, let's say. And so we skip past the disaster part to just have the experience of what it would be to live in such a world.
It is wood punk or eco punk, or it's this. I suppose I was very fascinated by this idea of it all. Well, I mean, I think Chambers also said it herself, right? I mean that everything, that the gods are real in that story, and that the robots thing, and they, as you said, they just decided to leave and everything. None of it needs to be scientifically justified. It is not scientifically justified in this story, and I guess that for some, or for a lot of readers, this decision to not engage with rational explanations is actually a relief. But for others, it can be or become a problem, especially if you think about what are the scenarios for adaptation or just recovery of forgetting to that scenario. And I was wondering, maybe where do you land personally? Do you think that this is I don't know, like a flaw of the Solarpunk genre, or this is something that is actually part of its potential appeal, of its critical appeal? This decision to not engage necessarily with the route to get to somewhere and just like go directly to this is a great scenario. This is a nice world that we could be living in.
In some ways, Sam is not very traditional solarpunk, even though I have said there's no huge tradition yet of solarpunk, or that there is, but the solarpunk that you might come across online, where most solarpunk is published by non-professional writers, spans from something something like Sam, of like, what would it be like to live? We're all homesteading, basically. It's solar-powered homesteading fantasies where there's kind of pleasant robots that amble around and, it's almost like a return to nature thing. And then there's the versions that are very much, the person who got the engineering degree in your community who is like a kind of an advancement of, the grandmother who's also was getting their kids to fix her phone, that kind of a thing. But now you're the community's go-to person to fix the water reclamation unit, to fix the solar panels, to fix the whatever. And then there is Solarpunk, what you could maybe still call Solarpunk, where it is almost stories that are instructional, how to build a water reclamation unit in the real world right now with a kind of fictional gleam to it. And Solarpunk would also be, say, a kind of movement in that sense. I think it's a website that's run from Barcelona from a small solar powered unit, and it includes a kind of permanent instructions for how to build things like water reclamation units. And that would be considered by some to be Solarpunk. It's not the literary arm of this movement, but it's a low tech, no carbon or anti carbon kind of movement, and stories, I guess, are the means of its dispersal. So in some ways, Solarpunk is very didactic. Sam is probably one of the least or the less didactic of it, even though it clearly has an intention. But in terms of the plausibility and the possibility, I mean, it's a big question for science fiction in general. I've approached this before from the potential or the perspective, I guess, of I think sometimes the scientificity of science fiction is a plea to take it seriously, to say, hey, this could actually happen. So pay attention for that reason. And this is also something that realism does. Like it's basically the reality effect of realism, of embedding this in the real world to kind of invite you to immerse yourself into it. But of course, there's different readers, there's different types of readers. My plea for something like Solarpunk would be that most of the science in science fiction is kind of bunk. It is more of a narrative or a trope, or it is there's always a wink behind it, and that's fine, and that's the way it should be. Sometimes the science in science fiction is not aligned with maybe the intention of the author. Like Kim Stanley Robinson has interesting instances where he's almost kind of retracted some of the science because he felt his Mars trilogy was too realistic, and that actually it made people think it was really possible to do this. And now we have all this investment in kind of Mars technology by people that were like, do they actually believe this or is it a scam? But they use Robinson's work as kind of like, this is really happening, give me $100 billion and I'll get us there. So there's always been a kind of funny thing in science fiction there. But I guess, again, from the reader-oriented perspective of not should you take the solutions that this book offers seriously, because it doesn't offer, well, or at least the plot of the book is not around solutions. The plot is personal. The plot is kind of existential in a way, in terms of the protagonist, Dex, who's a kind of non-binary tea monk. So their purpose is just to make tea and to get the best tea for a particular person to them. So the plot is really existential. I think that the worth of the jumping off point of just saying, let's all stand up and move into the wilderness, let the humans to it, is to just experience what it would be to like to live in that world. I want to go into one final thing, say on that, and I know I've talked for a bit there, but it only occurred to me yesterday. Part of the plot of the book basically is Dex has this kind of perfect life in one of the cities, but has become somewhat jaded by it, and basically becomes a traveling tea monk, settlement to settlement, gathers tea ingredients, and their purpose is kind of slightly therapeutic and slightly practical in that they pass messages along the settlements, but they sit down with people and they make tea and they either listen to them or they sit in silence with them. And it's just a simple act of community. But the tea monk Dex is dissatisfied with this. So they are a person whose role in society is to offer comfort, and they've become dissatisfied with it. And I've yesterday I thought, could you see Chambers in the same light as this? Because Chambers, if Chambers offers this book up actually, and it's one quote, as a cup of tea, as the comfort of a cup of tea. And we've talked a little bit about the book before, Jordy, and this idea of whether comfort is dangerous or not. But is there a possibility to see Becky Chambers also as this kind of dissatisfied tea monk, of kind of questioning the worth of this job, of offering comfort, of kind of letting people sit without their problems for a moment, even though they have to return to those problems? But yeah, there's something in there worth discussing, I think, further. But I'll drop it at that for now.
I think you're completely right that there's also part of the need of a story that doesn't have like other clear conflict points. So everything in the world seems more or less settled. Even some of the missions that the robot in the story is set out to do, which is to basically get to know whether how the humans are, and whether maybe it is time for them to like reconnect with human civilization. But really the core of, I guess, the trilogy, because even though the third installment hasn't been published yet, right, it's all about purpose, individual purpose, this search for, or this quest for purpose that is satisfying when all the needs are apparently covered. And this is something that in the second book, the focus is set more clearly, because the robot basically goes from town to town asking people, what do they need? That's the only question that the robot asks. And then it gets a lot of different answers. And there's all of these reflections on whether these answers are more individual or general. But you as a reader, you get this weird feeling of, hey guys, what you have is pretty good. I mean, this is a really nice arrangement. I can see why you don't really need anything in terms of societal comfort. You're just like saying, I would like my bicycle to be fixed. Things like that are very like trivial, etc. And that the need for, or the exploration of internal purpose, I guess, is something that you really require for the narrative, the story, to really work beyond just describing a world that is apparently utopian, right? And it's true that comfort is this double thing that's happening. So it is something that is very important for the protagonist, but it's something that perhaps the reader gets reflected, or gets this reflection back, this idea of, I would really like to either work as someone who prepares tea for a living, or I would really like someone to just like come and offer me tea as a way of therapy. And to get that this doesn't really like bring comfort in itself at a deeper level is an empathic move that creates complexity beyond just imagining solutions to the environmental crisis, and that can really hook readers beyond just like the rational aspect of, this is really a piece of environmental fiction, blah blah blah. It connects it to, let's say, to larger questions. And with this, I think it is. I had another question to you, which is associated perhaps with this tension that I think we've been moving around, or just like orbiting it all the time, which is the temporal situation of the story. This need for, as you said, that Solarpunk is true, there's not a big body of texts outside that explore it, but it is that we're getting there, right? And at least to my experience, all of them, or most of them, are set in a future. At least they are not set in the reader's present, right? If we approach this from the lens of catastrophe, we are not there yet. We're living through this slow and sometimes fast environmental collapse, right? So to put readers in this moment of recovery creates a kind of temporal gap, right? It's fiction that basically presupposes that survival arrives before readers have actually survived anything. So maybe my question is, does that gap bother you? Does it change what, in your opinion, Solarpunk can do for a reader who is living through the disaster to actually engage with a story that offers a scenario where everything has already quietly resolved?
I don't think it's a problem for me. I guess I noted something about comfort in the earlier. And I think with say disaster fiction, especially speculative disasters, say set in the future, I think when you get to the end of a text like that, something even like Ministry for the Future or like The Deluge, you have this feeling that you've kind of lived through something, or you've done something, because they're heavy, they can be boring at points, but they're also, spectacle can be difficult. Allowing yourself to feel a bit of fear or dread, or like, oh my God, we need to kind of get our act together, can feel like doing something. Something interesting that has been said about Solarpunk, I think that the scholar is Schuller, has talked about that you bring the disaster with you because it's not in the text. You have this, that the temporal gap is actually very generative because you know that you're not in that world. So when you're in a kind of more traditional disaster novel, or a traditional disaster novel, say, you understand that the temporal distance is kind of on the warning side of if we don't get our act together, this is going to happen. Where in something like Solarpunk, because there's potentially at times a lack of a disaster, so some Solarpunk is very much, it's more of in the trenches Solarpunk of like the small community-based things that are taking a little bit of carbon out of the air or helping a community kind of say in a desertifying area, how they're, greening that kind of landscape. Some of it is very much in the midst of the disaster, but something like Sound for the Wild Belt, because there's nothing that needs to be managed in terms of climate. It is being managed by a very complex system that is both societal and scientific in the text, and it determines basically everything. The carbon count is a kind of constant balancing act. But I think the reader does arrive with the interpretive framework of the Anthropocene. So I think the propulsion that can give this text, what it can provide is the kind of the after point or the aftermath. So we could see it as a break in terms of you take your 2 or 3 hours with Becky Chambers and a cup of tea and curl up on the couch, and you just get to experience kind of positive emotions for the future. But there's also, it's, let's say that's a possible reading or possible reading experience to have. But there is also the one of like longing for something like this, being worried that you'll never have the life that is like this, maybe even feeling pressured to provide this type of life to a kind of people of the future. So I think the disaster is never far away in terms of, I guess it depends on what the reader themselves are embedded in. So I don't see it as an issue. Because I think like that the text presupposes survival. If there is a reader, like say if it is an Earth analog, the reader themselves would be long dead by the time of this. Because they, unless the robots have actually stood up and walked out, the reader themselves is long dead. So it is for a future people that's imagining it. If this text kind of presupposes a survival or presupposes a way of survival obviously is not the focus of this particular Solarpunk text. The Anthropocene idea kind of presupposes extinction. Like I think that's more kind of dangerous than presupposing survival. Because presupposing extinction, just in terms of, say, again, to bring it back to all emotions, if you see yourself in that kind of long line of dominoes and you've already fallen over, it's like, well, might as well get that flight, might as well vote for the party that's going to, put money into my pocket more immediately rather than save the people in the future. Like if it's all over already and if there's nothing worth building towards, I'd say it's a bit more dangerous than the text that reminds you or casts a kind of glamour or something of like, look what could happen, or what has the essence of something that could happen.
Definitely. I think you said the other day when we were discussing preparing this episode something aligned that for me maybe encapsulates this affective purchase, let's say, of Solarpunk, and that I actually felt it while reading it, and is that it is an invitation to inhabiting a better future, and that inhabiting is very important also because it's not just about let's see, let's imagine, let's reflect on the relevance, the magnitude of the issue of how we get there. Is actually knowing or recording in yourself how you feel when you imagine a good scenario, because that's actually a good driving force to move forward and to actually overcome the paralysis that can come with just like being subjected to disastrous and apocalyptic scenarios all the time.
Yeah, I think in terms of the specific emotions as well, because we now have all of this data about awe and what it does to us. Positive awe can be very good for us in terms of it is very expansive. Positive awe can be as expansive as the expansion that caused that reaction. It's noted to be good for things like creative thinking. That to have an awe moment is to think about things differently, whereas negative awe effects, something like dread or horror, that makes us feel small in response to that vastness, but not a good smallness. Not, oh my God, look at the chain of being that I'm connected with, more the look at how many dominoes are falling towards me. That makes us think about the way things that an animal backed into a corner thinks, which is kind of scratching and kicking and trying to get out of the corner by any means necessary, but not necessarily. When you're not in an actual corner, that reaction is maybe not helpful. It's not to say that the bad emotion is bad and the good emotion is good. All can also be very mystifying. People who have fantasies of landing on Mars and starting a colony there and want to throw their money into that rather than, a kind of community recycling scheme. They have been mystified in some ways, to kind of borrow the Marxist term, but by that awe experience or that potentiality. They're having a positive emotional experience in terms of they really see themselves in that future. They see themselves striving towards something, but they would probably benefit from being a bit grounded. And at the same time, having a dread of something happening can be really good propulsion to solve something that is otherwise really far away. I know it probably differs across languages, but dread in English at least does have a kind of connotation of something creeping towards you, something kind of pursuing and relentless, but not necessarily the killer in the alleyway is not dread-inducing. That's kind of horror and shock immediately. But something that's kind of, I don't know, plodding towards you is kind of dreadful. And so it's not a simple case at least of kind of the good emotion that is good to feel is the best one to feel. But the balance, I think, is very important. And I think in some ways, Solarpunk just kind of fills in a niche on the science fiction kind of emotional table. Like if we were to think about the kind of the X and Y axis and the territories of them. And that was, I guess, again, to bring it back to the start, that's why it was started. The sense of wonder to futures had been kind of lost for good reason, but maybe it needed to be reclaimed in a new way. And maybe reclamation is the way of thinking about it too, because some of the futures that are being written at the moment from a very positive sense of wonder that are not Solarpunk are kind of like right-wing tech bro futures. So you don't necessarily want to lose a march or lose an entire field of emotion to people with ulterior motives or questionable aims and questionable futures.
I think it's to wrap it up. I think it's it's great to have Solarpunk as an addition not only to the X and Y or table of potential flavors of science fiction, but also to the diet of our catastrophic imaginations. It's not just focus on stories that imagine present or future collapses, but actually stories that show scenarios of overcoming or actually being after. It's a different kind of post-apocalyptic in which it is actually the disaster went completely to the background, and maybe dialogue with disaster imagination, not as you said it, not because it is in the text, but because we are carrying it with us. This was great, Ciarán. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is that your diet of disasters for the day has been
That's my diet. I mean, I'm very happy that I include that. I think
digested?
I need to include a bit more Solarpunk in my diet of disaster fiction. Kind of, I'm always an optimistic person, but it really need, from time to time you need a fix of some good old-fashioned optimism.
Yeah. Can I end with a final text to
Sure.
suggest to people? Again, because Solarpunk is kind of in the process of becoming, there is a contestation over whether it does need to be positive. And one of the most interesting examples of non-positive Solarpunk, which I think can be argued to be Solarpunk, because the solar is really worked into the DNA of this text, is a graphic novel series by the artist Ganzeer. And I've obviously forgotten the name. No, I haven't. It's called Solar Grid. And I think the first maybe 2 installations of it are free on his website. And that is, let's end with nuance. Even though we were happily ending with optimism, again, varied diet is always good. So maybe my contestation for whether that includes Solarpunk can be my sign off.
So sweet thing, but not too much sweet.
Yeah, the savory as well.